Oh, hey, hello, guys, and welcome to Ruben's History Show. Today, I'm going to talk about the Punic Wars. Well, the two Punic Wars, the first and second Punic Wars, which took place which the first war took place in the 264 BC when the Carthaginians invaded Sicily, and all the way to 241 BC when the Carthaginians surrendered, when the Romans won the war against the Carthaginians. And the second war lasted for 17 years from 218 BC all the way to 101 BC. So that war basically just lasted for 17 years. So in this part, I'm going to talk about the first and second Punic Wars, which took place in the 200s BC, and then in my next video, I'm going to talk about the third Punic War, which took place in 149 BC all the way to 146 BC, which just lasted for 3 years. So, the first war was started in 264 BC. So that was when the Carthaginians invaded Sicily. So, but before that, the Romans and the Carthaginians had peaceful relationships. They were not like enemies. So they had peaceful relationships during that time. That was in 509 BC. So that was the same time when the Rome became kingdom, became republic. Sorry. So during that time, and also at the same time in 750 BC, that was when Carthage was found. So Carthage today is a colony. No, Carthage was a colony in Tunisia, but now it's Tunisia in the present day, which is now Tunisia. But then it was Carthage. It was a Carthaginian, ancient Carthage. And the people in Carthage, they spoke Punic. That was the official language of Carthage at that time. So the war began in 264 BC when the Carthaginians invaded Sicily. So that triggered a war during that time, and that started the First Punic War, which took place in 264 BC. So after that, the war just lasted for 23 years, which just basically lasted for 2 decades. And the war just lasted for 2 decades. That's almost like no, that's just basically lasted for 2 decades. The second Punic War, the first Punic War, and then Hannibal's father, Hamilcar Bolcar, thought on the Carthaginian side because he was a Carthaginian general. He was the father of future Carthaginian general Hannibal, who would fight against the Romans and Scipio Africanus, who would later defeat Hannibal in the Second War in the 102 BC when Scipio defeated Hannibal at the Battle of Zama on October 19th, 202 BC. So after that, they fought each other for about 23 years, and then after that, the first Punic War ended in victory, and then the Romans had forced the Carthaginians to pay the damage that they caused to Sicily when the Carthaginians invaded Sicily in the 264 BC, which started the first Punic War and the 264 BC. So after that, they had to pay the damage to Carthage that the Carthaginians caused, and then years later, the second Punic War would start, and then that would start a second Punic War at that time. So, and then before the first Punic War started, the Rome and Carthage were the two superpowers of the Mediterranean because they had control of that region during that time. They were kind of like the superpowers of, for example, like the Soviet Union and the United States during the Cold War time, when they had this nuclear weapons, and they were superpowers of the Cold War, the United States and the former Soviet Union, which is present day Russia. So anyway, after the first Punic War, his Hannibal's brother was in command of the Carthaginian fleet, and during that time after the first Punic War, and then in 121 BC, following Hasdrubal's death, Hannibal took over the control of the Carthaginian fleet during that time. And then also, when Hamilcar went to Spain to fight against the Romans, his son Hannibal wanted to fight with him, and so he took Hannibal with him, and they fought the Romans together. And his father taught him to hate the Romans at that time, when the first war took place in 264 BC. BC is basically this before Christ. That was before Christ was born. And then AD means after that, and that means that was after Christ was killed, after the birth of Christ. So, and then after that, in 218 BC, that was the time when Hannibal attacked Saguntum, which is an ally of Rome. It's a city located in Spain, and that was an ally of the Roman Republic at the time. That was before it became the Roman Empire, officially the Roman Empire, after Augustus defeated Mark Antony in the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, which took place during that time, and he was defeated. And so the Great War, or the Second Punic War, started with the Romans and the Carthaginians once again. So there was a war between those two superpowers of the Mediterranean. And so the Romans won the Second Punic War, the First Punic War, because of their manpower that they used against the Carthaginians. And so that's why the Romans won, and the Carthaginians lost the First Punic War in the 241 BC. And that led to Carthaginians' defeat in the First Punic War. And then in the spring of 218 BC was the time when Hannibal left New Carthage, or Nova Carthage, in the South Spain, and that's where he attacked the Spain at the time. And so Romans fought the Carthaginians at that time. And so Hannibal crossed the Gaul, which was where Caesar was fighting the Gallic tribes and the German tribes while he was in Germany, and to 58 BC all the way to 50 or 51 BC, before he crossed the Rubicon River in the 49 BC, which started the civil war between Pompey and Julius Caesar. So then he crossed the Alps, where there was snow and ice. It was so cold there. And he crossed the Alps so he could fight the Romans at the time. And he had war elephants. They were basically kind of like the ancient version of the tanks. They were like tanks, basically, the elephants. And so they had them, and they used them to fight against the Romans, the war elephants, during that time, during the Second Punic War and the First Punic War. So, and then in November 218 BC, Hannibal arrived on the Alps, which is in Europe. It's in Europe now, and then it was at that time. And he arrived with 20,000 infantry and 37 war elephants during that time. and then he thought the Romans there, and then he killed Romans in battle, and then he addressed his troops, and saying he addressed his troops that were going to attack the Romans, and then in December of Hannibal defeated three great Roman armies during the first Punic War, during the second Punic War, from 212 BC all the way to 101 BC. So those were great defeats of the Roman armies at the time. So the Battle of Cannae, Lake Trasimene, and Turbine. Those were the three battles that Hannibal destroyed the Romans in battle, destroyed the Roman armies in battle. And so that was in June of 217. That was when Hannibal defeated the Roman armies in the Battle of Lake Trasimene. Though that was the battle he defeated. He defeated the Roman armies at that time, and so he defeated them in battle. And then during the war and after the war, I believe, the Romans were recovering from the war, from the Second Punic War, and the Romans found out that over thousands of Romans were killed by Hannibal and the Carthaginians during the 17-year war between the Romans and the Carthaginians. And so the Second Punic War was a national war, kind of like World War II, because like thousands of troops were killed. That's kind of basically it's same like with World War II, the Second Punic War, if you compare it to World War II. From 1939 to 1945, which basically lasted for 6 years, the Second World War. And so in August of 216 BC, that was the time when Hannibal defeated the Roman armies in Cannae, which took place in August 216 BC. So he won the battle because he thought the Romans in the Cannae, and then the Roman army was circled. They were circled. They circled the Romans. And so the Carthaginians and Hannibal defeated the Romans in battle during that time. And then Scipio would defeat Hannibal in the Second Punic War. And then he was fighting against Carthaginians in the battles. And so these events take place 100 years after Alexander the Great and his conquests of the Parthian Empire, of the Persian Empire, or the Academian Empire, and Egypt, ancient Egypt, which Egypt fell under the rule of the Greeks, and that became the Ptolemaic Egypt. Egypt came under Greek rule following Alexander the Great's death. Because if you remember, this areas were divided between the Alexander the Great's generals during that period. And so the Syria was divided, Egypt was divided, and this couple other places were divided, and that each had their king at the time. And each of Alexander the Great's generals were in control of their areas. And so Scipio was made the consul at the age of 27. When he was 27 years old at the time, he was 27 at the time. And then in 208 BC was the time when the Roman senators were killed at the Belsola, which is in Spain. And so the Carthaginians killed Roman senators, and they were killed at the time. And the Rome did not collapse after the three battles because Scipio defeated the Carthaginians and defeated Hannibal at the end of the war and near the end of the war. And so he and then Scipio's father was also the consul of 218 BC, and then he died during that time, the same time when the Second Punic War began during that time. And then also during the Second Punic War, Scipio Africanus trained the Romans to fight the Carthaginians in battle. And so Scipio, during that time, during the Second Punic War, Scipio moved south of Spain. And from there, he also studied the tactics of Hannibal and he knew all his moves of what Hannibal was capable of during that time and what his abilities were and what he could do. And so Hannibal couldn't capture Rome because he was still fighting the Romans. But he was in Italy for 15 years during that time. But Scipio managed to capture Carthage. Why? Because he defeated the Carthaginians in the battle. That's why he managed to capture Carthage, and he made the Carthaginians surrender. Hannibal surrendered at the time, and that made the Carthaginians surrender at the time. And so the Spaniards did not like the Carthaginians because the Spaniards were allies with Rome, and also the Spaniards spoke Latin because that was the official language of the Romans or the Roman Republic at the time. And so he returned to Rome. He returned to Rome from Spain, and he was also elected the consul for the year of 102 BC. So he was consul during that time, and that was after he left Spain, where he defeated the Carthaginians during that period. And then also in 204 BC, Scipio led a Roman army to Africa because and then if you remember in 102 BC, Scipio wanted to be the governor of Sicily, so he could launch his invasion of Carthage of North Africa, or Carthage, but the Romans said no, because maybe if there's a good opportunity, we'll give you this position. That's what the Romans said to Scipio during that time. And so Scipio left Rome and he went to Sicily, and then he recruited these privateers, Roman privateers or private citizens. And so from there he launched his invasion of Carthage in 204 BC during that time. And then Scipio launched a series of campaigns against the Carthaginians during that period while he was in Carthage. And there was also a rule that the Roman commander can negotiate with the enemy, can talk to them to surrender. And so there was a time when the Carthaginians were asleep. The Romans launched an element of surprise. They attacked the Carthaginians. They launched arrows actually, and they shot the arrows at the Carthaginians while they were asleep, kind of like in the 300 movie. If you remember when the Persians launched the arrows at the Spartans, and they used the shields so they could avoid being hit by the arrows. And then Hannibal said to himself why he didn't march on Rome, because he wanted to know why he didn't march on the Rome at the time, because the Romans made the Carthaginians leave Italy. No, because Hannibal was forced to go to Carthage because he heard about the situation of the Roman invasion of Africa. And so that's the reason why Hannibal left Italy and he went to Carthage fi- to to fix the problem at the time. And then Hannibal was talking about a treaty with with the Romans with Scipio, and so and then Scipio wanted Hannibal to surrender at the time. And so they were having a conversation with Scipio Africanus. And so he said to Scipio that he's an older man than Scipio because Hannibal was born in 247 BC. So that was about just 6 years before the first Punic War ended during that period. And Scipio was born in 236 BC. So he was just 8 years, 11 years older than Hannibal, 11 years younger than Hannibal. And then also during that time when the Romans invaded Africa, Hannibal had over 80 war elephants during that period. The war elephants were tanks, the ancient version of tanks. They were basically like tanks, and so they used them against the Romans in battle. And so the Romans defeated the Carthaginians at the battle of Zama, which is located in Africa. It is located in Africa. And so after that, the Carthaginians surrendered, and that brought an end to the Second Punic War, which lasted for 17 years, from 218 BC all the way to 101 BC. So that basically lasted for 17 years, that war. And that was also the time when the Carthaginians surrendered. And so following this, Scipio celebrated his great triumph over the Carthaginians. And then he was hailed by the Roman people, and he celebrated his triumph over the Carthaginians, and Hannibal surrendered after that. And so, Hannibal did not want to be a prisoner of the Romans, and so he fled to I think it was the kingdom of Armenia, I believe at the time, and he fled to the kingdom of Armenia at the time. And so after that, years later, the Second Punic War would start. The Third Punic War would start in 149 BC, and that war would last all the way to 146 BC. So in the next video, I'm going to talk about the Third Punic War, and I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Please drop a like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the future videos.